You're watching the story of a 72-year-old woman, someone everyone thought was past her prime. But they were wrong. This is the story of betrayal from the very people who call themselves family, and how an older woman not only survives, but triumphs. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next earth-shattering stories. Like and comment with the name of the city or country you're watching. I want to know how far my story has traveled in this world. I used to think that surviving was enough. After 40 years of building something from nothing, from a rented office barely big enough for a desk to a company with hundreds of employees and contracts with hospital systems across the country, I told myself that the hard part was behind me. I had earned the right to sit down, to breathe, to finally be still without guilt gnawing at the back of my skull. My name is Evelyn Hartwell. I am 72 years old. And 3 months ago, the person I invited to a celebration dinner to share the greatest achievement of my life tried to poison me. Not with a bullet, not with a knife. With a powder dissolved slowly into crystal water, designed not to kill me but to unmake me, to strip away my mind, my credibility, my name, so that someone I had welcomed into my family could take everything I had spent my entire life building. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. Not in that restaurant. Not at that table under the warm chandelier light, not with the sound of wine glasses and soft jazz. Let me start the way everything in my life has started, quietly, without ceremony, in a moment so small I almost missed it. Ikab. The day I signed the final papers for the sale of Hartwell MedTech, my attorney handed me a pen and said, "Evelyn, most people don't make it here." I signed without trembling. I had been waiting for that moment for 4 years. 4 years of negotiations, audits, pushback from the acquiring firm, 3 rounds of due diligence that felt like being dissected alive. When it was over, when the ink dried on a transaction worth more than I had ever allowed myself to dream, I sat in that conference room for a long time after everyone else had left. I didn't cry. I wasn't that kind of woman anymore. Maybe I used to be once, before the company swallowed my 30s and 40s and most of my 50s whole. Before my husband, Gerald, got sick, and then got sicker, and then was gone before I had time to process either. Before my son, Daniel, grew up in the margins of my schedule and learned to love me the way you love a photograph, at a distance, with a kind of admiring resignation. I sat in that empty conference room and I thought, now what? I didn't have an answer, but I thought maybe celebration was a start. The dinner was my idea. I chose the restaurant myself, Aldrich and Pine, on the corner of Whitmore Avenue and 6th, the kind of place with linen tablecloths and a wine list that came in a leather binder. Not because I needed to show off. I had nothing left to prove to anyone, but because I wanted one night that felt like it meant something. One dinner where my son and I could sit across a table without his phone between us, without the old silences pressing down like weather. Daniel arrived with his wife, Clara. She wore a cream-colored dress and her hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless and clearly wasn't. She kissed my cheek when she saw me, both hands on my arms, and said, "Evelyn, you look wonderful. You really do." I thanked her. I should have noticed it then, the way her eyes moved to my handbag, the way they moved to the folder I had tucked beside my chair, just a few documents I'd brought from the attorney's office, nothing important, mostly copies. The way she looked at those papers, the way you look at something you've already decided you're going to take. But I didn't notice. Or maybe I noticed and filed it somewhere I wasn't ready to open yet. Daniel ordered for the table. He always did, even when I hadn't asked him to. And we settled into the kind of conversation that looked like family from the outside. He asked about the sale. I gave him the outline, not the number, because I had learned years ago that money had a way of changing the temperature in a room. Clara asked questions that sounded casual and weren't. How was the transition structured? Had I worked with a financial advisor on the proceeds? What were my plans for the estate? Had I updated my documents recently? "Just curious," she said, touching the stem of her wine glass. "We worry about you, you know, being on your own." I smiled. "I've been on my own for a long time." "You have," she said. "That's exactly what I mean." Daniel put his hand over mine. He had his father's hands. Broad, warm, a little rough. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of, Mom. That's all." Taken care of. I turned that phrase over in my mind the way you'd turn a coin, looking at both sides. I appreciate that, I said. And I meant it. I was still capable of meaning it, even then. That's the thing no one tells you about betrayal. It doesn't arrive with a warning label. It arrives wearing your son's father's hands and a cream-colored dress and a smile that knows exactly how to reach you. The restaurant filled up as the evening moved on. The light shifted to something warmer, amber, the kind of light that softens edges and makes you feel, for a moment, that things are all right. We ordered a second round. Clara excused herself to the restroom, and Daniel leaned across the table to tell me that the firm he worked for was going through changes, restructuring, possibly layoffs, and that things had been stressful lately. I'm sorry, I said. Why didn't you say something earlier? He looked away. You had a lot going on. Daniel, I'm your mother. He nodded, but the way he nodded told me he'd stopped believing that meant what it used to mean. I didn't push. I never knew how to push with him without it turning into something else. We sat in a quiet that was not quite comfortable, not quite hostile, just the particular silence of two people who love each other imperfectly and have never found the right language for it. That's when the young waiter appeared at my elbow. He was maybe 25, dark-haired, with the kind of careful movements that told me he was new and trying not to show it. He refilled my water glass, and as he leaned close, I heard him say, almost without moving his lips, barely above a whisper, "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. Don't look toward the bar, the woman you're with, the one in the cream dress. I saw her put something in your drink. While you were talking to the gentleman, she reached into her bag and it was fast. I almost missed it myself. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do." I did not look toward the bar. I did not move. I set my fork down slowly, the way you set something down when every muscle in your body is working against you, and I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth, and I said, very quietly, "Thank you. Please go about your work. And your name?" "Noah," he said. "Noah Bennett." "Thank you, Noah." He straightened and moved away, and I sat very still, and I looked at my glass of water with its perfect clarity, its ice already beginning to melt at the edges, and I thought about the fact that Clara had been gone exactly long enough to make a stop somewhere other than the restroom. I thought about the questions she had asked about my estate. I thought about the folder of documents beside my chair, and the way her eyes had found it. I thought about Daniel's face when he said, "We just want to make sure you're taken care of." And something in me went very, very cold. Clara came back to the table. She settled into her chair with the ease of someone who had done exactly what she planned to do and was satisfied with the result. She reached for her wine. She smiled at me across the table. "Sorry about that," she said. "Where were we?" "You were telling me about Daniel's work," I said. She pivoted smoothly. "Right, yes. It's been a difficult few months." I watched her hands. I watched the way she did not look at my water glass. The specific, deliberate way you don't look at something you're watching without watching. The way her gaze kept sliding past it and away, like a magnet repelling. I had built a company from scratch. I had negotiated with people who wanted to take it from me. I had sat across tables from men twice my size who underestimated me because of my age, my gender, the softness of my voice. I had learned, over 40 years, how to read a room the way some people read weather, by feeling the pressure change before the storm arrived. The pressure in that room had changed. I needed to think, and I needed to act without letting either of them know I was thinking or acting. I reached for my glass of water, and then I knocked it over. "Oh, goodness." I pressed my hand to my mouth. "I'm so sorry. The waiter, Noah, was there almost immediately, cloth napkin in hand, cleaning the spill with practiced efficiency. Daniel waved him off and helped. In the small chaos of cloth napkins and apologies, I reached across to Clara's side of the table on the pretense of helping move her bag out of the way of the spill, and in doing so, I picked up her glass of water. Nearly identical to mine, same crystal, same ice, same level, and I set it down in front of me. The switch took 3 seconds, maybe less. Clara barely glanced at the glasses. She was watching Daniel's face. That was her mistake, the first of many. When things settled and we rearranged ourselves at the table, I looked down at the glass now sitting in front of me. the one that had been in front of Clara, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Grief. Not fear, not rage. Grief. Because even in that moment, some part of me was still hoping I was wrong. Some part of me wanted Noah to have misread what he saw, wanted Clara's sideways glances to mean nothing, wanted my instincts, which had rarely failed me in 40 years of business, to fail me now because the alternative was something I didn't know how to carry. But the glass was in front of me, and I was still thinking clearly. And in 15 minutes, I would find out. The rest of the dinner moved in slow motion. Clara talked about a home renovation she was planning. Daniel talked about a weekend trip they were considering. I contributed what I needed to contribute. A question here, a comment there, the ordinary scaffolding of polite conversation. Inside, I was somewhere else entirely. I was going through files in my mind, sorting through the last 6 months of Claire's behavior with a ruthless precision I hadn't allowed myself before. The visits that had started after the sale was announced. The questions that always circled back to numbers and documents and plans, the way she had laughed a little too brightly when I mentioned my attorney's name. The brochure for a senior care facility I had found tucked inside a magazine in their guest bathroom 3 weeks ago when I had stayed the night after Daniel's birthday dinner. I had told myself it was nothing. Research for someone else, something they'd picked up accidentally. I had told myself a lot of things. "Evelyn, are you all right?" Daniel asked. "You've gone quiet." "I'm just tired," I said. "It's been a long week." "Of course it has." Clara reached across the table and patted my hand. Her fingers were cool. "You've been through so much. The sale, all those meetings. You should be resting." "I think you're right," I said, and I watched her smile deepen with something that wasn't warmth. 17 minutes after the switch, Clara reached for the glass. Her glass, which was now sitting in front of her but which she had not touched since the spill. She drank slowly, the way you drink when you're watching something else. She set it down. She looked at her phone. She looked at Daniel. She laughed at something he said. Then she stopped laughing. It started with her eyes. A slight lose of focus, the way a camera lens does when the autofocus loses its grip. Her hand went to the table, steadying, though she didn't know she was steadying. She blinked twice, 3 times. Color drained from her face in a visible wave, the way tide pulls back from shore. "Clara?" Daniel said. She pressed her fingers to her temple. "I feel strange. I feel very—" She swayed in her chair. Daniel was on his feet before the sentence finished. I sat where I was. My hands were folded in my lap. My breathing was even. A waiter called for help. Someone near the entrance was already pulling out a phone. Noah, at the far end of the room, met my eyes for 1 second. Just one, and then looked away. I sat where I was. I thought about 40 years of building something that mattered. I thought about my husband's hands and my son's distance and the folder of documents beside my chair. I thought about the word guardian and the word estate and the word decline, and I thought, they chose the wrong woman. Whatever was in that water, whatever had been intended for me, was not something I intended to let pass quietly. Not now. Not after everything. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. I rode with them because Daniel asked me to. I held my son's hand in the back of that vehicle while his wife lay with her eyes half open and her body doing things it shouldn't have been doing. And I was gentle with him because he was my son, and I had to believe, that he didn't know, that he was as much a victim of this as I was, just in a different way. But I was already planning, not out of cruelty, not out of anger, out of something older and steadier than either of those things. Out of the understanding that I had not spent 40 years fighting to simply hand over everything I was the moment someone decided I was old enough to be disposable. I was 72 years old. I had earned every year of it, and I was just getting started. The hospital at night has a particular kind of silence that isn't really silence at all. It's the sound of machines doing the work that bodies have stopped doing reliably. It's the low murmur of nurses at a station, the distant wheel squeak of a cart, the occasional announcement over an intercom that cuts through everything else and then disappears, leaving the quiet feeling heavier than it did before. I had spent time in hospitals, Too much time, in the years when Gerald was sick, and I had never made peace with that sound, the way it pretended to be calm when everything underneath it was anything but. I sat in a chair outside the room where Clara was being evaluated, and I watched my son pace. Daniel had always been a pacer. When he was 12 and had done something wrong, he paced his bedroom in that particular rhythm that told me before he said a word that something had happened. He was doing the same thing now. 6 steps, one direction, pivot, 6 steps back. His hands in the pockets of his jacket, his face doing the complicated arithmetic of a person who doesn't yet understand the problem they're being asked to solve. They said it might have been something she ate, he said, not for the first time. An allergic reaction, maybe. Or a medication interaction. Maybe, I said. She's been under a lot of stress. Her immune system probably... Daniel? I said his name the way I used to when he was young and trying to explain something that didn't quite add up. Not harsh, just steady. The voice that said, I'm listening, but I'm also paying attention. He stopped pacing and looked at me. What? Sit down, I said. Please. He sat. He was 51 years old, and in that moment he looked like every version of himself I had ever known. The 12-year-old with the guilty conscience, the teenager who couldn't look me in the eye, the man who had gradually learned to love me from a careful distance. I looked at his face, and I thought about how much I did not want what I was beginning to understand to be true. How long has Clara been asking about my finances? I asked. The question landed in the air between us like something dropped from a height. What? His voice shifted. Not defensively, not immediately, but with the quality of a person who was hoping they'd heard wrong. My finances, I said, my estate planning, my documents. How long has she been asking? She hasn't been. She's just concerned. We're both concerned. You're 72, Mom. That's not an insult. It's just a fact. At some point we need to what? He opened his mouth and closed it again. I waited. I had learned patience the same way I learned everything else. Out of necessity, out of the understanding that silence was often more powerful than anything you could fill it with. I folded my hands in my lap, and I waited. And I watched my son's face move through something I couldn't fully read. She just wants to make sure you're taken care of, he finally said. And the repetition of that phrase, the exact same words she had used at dinner, hit me somewhere I hadn't been prepared for. Taken care of, I repeated. Yes. By whom? He looked at his hands. By family. I didn't say anything else. Not because I had nothing to say, but because there were things I needed to know before I said them. And the room where Clara was being evaluated was just behind a door that hadn't opened yet. And the doctor who would come through that door would either confirm what Noah had told me, or he wouldn't. And until then, everything I said could be used against me in ways I wasn't ready to navigate. I understood that already. I understood it in my bones, with the particular fluency of a woman who had spent 4 decades in rooms where people underestimated her and paid for it. So I sat, and I waited, and I listened to my son tell me that his wife was a caring person who only wanted what was best for everyone. The doctor's name was Fenwick. Dr. Paul Fenwick, 50-ish, with the air of someone used to delivering news in careful, cushioned language. He came through the door and directed his explanation almost entirely at Daniel, which was the kind of thing that happened to me more often, now that I was in my 70s. This reflexive sidelining, this assumption that the younger person in the room was the relevant one. I had stopped being invisible about it years ago. Doctor, I said before he finished his second sentence, I'm Evelyn Hartwell. This is my son. I'd like to understand exactly what happened. He looked at me. A small recalibration happened behind his eyes. Of course, Mrs. Hartwell, your daughter-in-law appears to have ingested a compound that caused acute neurological symptoms, disorientation, vertigo, involuntary muscle response. We're running a tox panel to identify the specific substance. What kind of compound? I asked. Roughly. It's too early to say precisely. Roughly, I said again. He paused. The symptom profile is consistent with certain sedative compounds, ones that in low doses can cause impaired cognition and confusion that might look, to an outside observer, like an episode of acute mental decline. The room went very still. Daniel looked at the doctor, then at me. Something moved across his face that I couldn't name. A shadow, a flicker. There, and then gone. Mental decline, Wes, I said. In someone presenting with those symptoms, yes, it might be interpreted that way by someone without medical training, but the blood work will tell us more. We should have initial results within the hour. He left. Daniel stood very still beside me. I did not look at my son. I looked at the door the doctor had just walked through, and I thought about the specific cruelty of what I was beginning to understand. Not a poison to kill, a poison to unmake. A compound designed to produce exactly the kind of confusion and instability that would make a 72-year-old woman look like she was losing her mind. In a restaurant full of witnesses, in front of her son, the mechanics of it arrived in my mind fully formed, the way a business plan sometimes arrived, with terrible clarity. If I had drunk from that glass, I would have been the one sitting in this hospital, disoriented, unable to give a coherent account of the evening, possibly unable to remember details clearly. And Clara would have been the composed, concerned daughter-in-law translating my confusion for the doctors, my son nodding beside her, both of them agreeing that yes, this had been coming for a while. Yes, they had been worried about her. Yes, she really wasn't capable of managing her own affairs anymore. The word they would have used was guardianship. I knew that word. I had a client once, years ago, a man in his early 80s, whose adult children had petitioned for guardianship under similar pretenses. By the time it was sorted out, his estate had been partially liquidated, and his lawyer's fees had consumed what was left of his liquid assets. He spent his last years in a facility he hadn't chosen, surrounded by people he hadn't picked, watching the money he'd built disappear into the hands of children who had decided he was finished before he was. That was not going to be my story. I stood up from the chair outside Clara's room, smoothed the front of my jacket, and told Daniel I needed some air. He offered to come with me. "Stay with your wife," I said, not unkindly, just clearly. In the corridor near the stairwell, where it was quieter, I called my attorney. Marcus Vale had been my attorney for 11 years, long enough that he answered my calls on the first ring after 7 in the evening, which told you something about the nature of our professional relationship. He was good in the way that certain people are good, not flashy, not performative, but with a quality of attention that made you feel that your problem was the only problem in the room. "Evelyn," he said, "it's late." "I know. Are you somewhere you can talk?" A pause. The sound of a door closing. "I am now." I told him what had happened. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. The dinner, Noah, the switch, the hospital. What Dr. Fenwick had said about the symptom profile. I kept my voice level the whole time, which cost me more than I let on, because underneath the level voice something was shaking that I hadn't let shake since Gerald died. Marcus was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then, "You said you switched the glasses." "Yes." "Before she drank?" "Yes." "So whatever she ingested was intended for you?" "Yes." Another pause, longer. "Evelyn, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not speak to Clara or to Daniel about any of this tonight. Do not speak to the doctor about your suspicions. I want you to ask a nurse, someone neutral, not someone Clara's team is already talking to preserve a sample of whatever they're analyzing in that tox panel. Tell them you believe there may have been a contamination issue at the restaurant and you need the record for a potential civil matter. Say it in those terms exactly." "I know how to talk to people, Marcus." "I know you do. I'm just being careful." He exhaled. "There's something else I need to tell you. There's something I've been sitting on for 2 weeks because I wasn't sure it was enough to act on." My hand tightened on the phone. "Tell me." 3 weeks ago, a legal firm called Prescott and Dulain submitted a records request through our office. They asked for documentation related to your mental health evaluations over the past 5 years. Routine records, technically, but Prescott and Dulain specializes in one thing, Evelyn: competency proceedings. The word landed like something physical. "Competency," I said. They retracted the request 2 days later, which is part of why I wasn't sure it warranted immediate alarm. But in light of what you're telling me tonight, Clara hired them. I don't know that. Marcus. A beat. I have no evidence of that, but you suspect it. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I stood in that hospital corridor with my phone pressed against my ear, and I felt the shape of what had been built around me. Slowly, patiently, over months that I had spent assuming the worst was behind me. Competency proceedings, medical records requests, a drug designed to make me look unstable, a son who kept using his wife's language. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a plan, built over time, piece by piece. The way you build a cage, not all at once because that would be too obvious, but one bar at a time so the person inside doesn't notice until the door closes. I need to find out everything, I said. Everything she's done. Every document, every contact, every meeting she's had in the last 6 months that touches anything near my estate. Evelyn, I know you need time. I know there are procedures, but Marcus, my voice caught. Just slightly. Just once. They were going to make me disappear. Not kill me, just disappear me. Into a diagnosis, into a guardianship, into a facility somewhere while someone else signed my name on things I'd spent my whole life building. I stopped. Breathed. I need you to help me make sure that doesn't happen. It's not going to happen, he said. Firm, clean, no cushioning. Get the sample preserved. Go back to your son. Be the calm one in the room and call me first thing tomorrow. I said I would. I hung up. I stood in the corridor for another minute by myself, in the particular way that you stand when you are reconstructing your spine from the inside. When you are deciding consciously and deliberately that you are not going to fall apart. Not tonight. Not where anyone can see. Then I went back to the waiting room. Clara was moved to a private room around midnight. The initial tox panel showed traces of a compound the attending physician described as a benzodiazepine-adjacent sedative, not commonly prescribed, consistent with recent synthesis rather than pharmaceutical production. He said the words carefully, watching all of our faces as he said them. Clara said she had no idea how it could have gotten into her system. She said she had eaten and drunk nothing unusual that evening except at the restaurant. She said it with her eyes steady and her voice calm, and I watched Daniel absorb her words with the particular helplessness of a man who was hearing a story he needed to be true. I watched her lie, and I said nothing. That was the hardest part. Not the fear, not even the grief, but sitting in a hospital chair at midnight watching someone perform innocence and holding my tongue when everything in me wanted to say what I knew. There is a particular violence in choosing silence when you have something real to say. But Marcus's voice was in my head. Be the calm one in the room. And I was old enough to know that the first person who loses their composure in a room like that is the person who loses. I was not going to lose. At one point, Clara looked at me across the room. Her color was better by then. She had stabilized, the doctors had said, and would recover fully within 24 hours. She looked at me with something in her eyes that might have been gratitude and might have been something else entirely. Something harder and more calculating that she had arranged gratitude on top of like a slipcover on a chair that needed reupholstering. Thank you for being here, Evelyn, she said. You didn't have to stay. Your family, I said, and I watched something shift in her face, almost imperceptible, just a microtension in the muscles around her mouth, as she tried to read whether I meant it or whether I knew. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. 40 years of negotiation is good for something. Daniel drove me home around 2 a.m. We didn't talk much. He was exhausted and scared in the way that people get scared when something has happened that they don't understand yet. And I wasn't going to be the one to fill in the parts he didn't know. Not in a car at 2 a.m. when neither of us was at our best. But when he pulled into my driveway and I reached for the door handle, he said, Mom. Yes. She's a good person. His voice had something underneath it I hadn't heard in a while. Something raw, unguarded. I know she comes across as... I know she can seem a certain way, but she loves this family. She loves you. I turned to look at my son. His profile in the dark, his father's jaw and my mother's eyes, and 51 years of us figuring out how to be in each other's lives. "I hope you're right," I said. It was the truest thing I had said all night. I didn't sleep. I sat at the desk in my study, the same desk I'd had for 30 years, scarred and ink-stained and completely ignored by every interior designer who had ever tried to get me to replace it. And I started to work. Not frantically, methodically. The way I had always worked, the way that had built a company from a rented office. One document, one piece of information, one careful step at a time. I wrote down everything I could remember about the last 6 months, every visit from Clara, every question she had asked, every moment my estate documents had been within reach of her hands. I wrote it all down in longhand, the old-fashioned way, because old habits and because I had learned decades ago that the act of writing something down forces a kind of precision that typing doesn't always require. When I had 2 pages of notes, I stopped and looked at what I had. It was a pattern so clear that I was almost embarrassed by how long it had taken me to see it. The visits had started within 10 days of the announcement that Hartwell MedTech was in final stage negotiations. They had intensified after the sale was confirmed. The questions about my estate had escalated from casual to pointed over the course of 3 months. And threaded through all of it, quiet, subtle, easy to dismiss in isolation, was a persistent narrative that I was tired, that I deserved rest, that I shouldn't have to manage so much on my own, that the complexity of my affairs was too much for someone my age. Someone my age. I thought about the brochure in the magazine rack in their guest bathroom. The name of the facility was Sycamore Ridge Senior Living. I had not written it down when I found it, but I had remembered it the way you remember something that bothers you before you understand why it bothers you. I pulled my laptop toward me and searched the name. Sycamore Ridge Senior Living was a memory care and long-term residential facility in the eastern part of the state. It had a website with photographs of smiling elderly people doing watercolor painting and gentle chair yoga. It had a 5-star rating on 2 different review platforms, which told me very little except that someone had managed their online presence carefully. It had a per-month residential fee that would have been significant for most people, but not by any measure for me. And it had a partnership program with a legal services firm called Prescott & Delane that helped families navigate the complex process of establishing financial and medical guardianship for aging loved ones. Prescott & Delane, the same firm Marcus had mentioned, the same firm that had requested my mental health records and then quietly retracted the request. I sat back in my chair and looked at that partnership listing on the screen for a long time. They had not just been improvising. They had not decided over dinner one night to grab what they could. This had been researched, mapped. There was a facility already chosen, a legal firm already identified, a drug obtained. Not easily, not cheaply, not without advanced planning. A plan constructed so carefully that if everything had gone the way it was supposed to go, I would have been sitting in that hospital looking confused and unreliable, and by morning there would have been doctors and attorneys and my own son telling a story about how this had been coming for a while. I pressed my hand flat against the desk to stop it from shaking. I was not a woman who cried easily. I had not cried when Gerald died. Not really. Not in front of anyone. I had grieved him in private. In small increments, over years, the way you grieve someone when you don't have time to do it all at once. I had not cried when my business partner tried to force me out in my late 40s. I had not cried when the acquiring firm's lead negotiator had called me charming, but over her head, in a hallway conversation he didn't know I could hear. I didn't cry now either, but I came close, because the thing that was breaking something in me was not the scheme itself, not the drug, not Prescott and Delane, not Sycamore Ridge with its watercolor painting and chair yoga. It was Daniel. It was the question of Daniel, which I had been circling all night without letting myself get close to it. Did he know? I didn't know. I didn't know, and not knowing was its own kind of devastation, because the 2 possibilities led to such completely different places. If he didn't know, then he was a man who had been slowly manipulated by a woman he loved into a posture that made him complicit without understanding what he was complicit in, which was terrible and recoverable. If he did know, If those conversations about taking care of me and managing my affairs were not naivety but participation, then I was not just facing a daughter-in-law's betrayal. I was facing my son's. I sat with that question in the dark of my study for a long time, and I decided, not because the evidence pointed clearly to innocence, but because I needed to decide something I could act on, that I would proceed as though Daniel didn't know. I would give him the benefit of a doubt I wasn't sure he deserved, because the alternative was a grief too large to carry while I was still in the middle of fighting. That was the most human part of me that night, the part that chose love over certainty when I didn't have enough of either. At 5 in the morning, I made coffee and went through the financial documents in my home filing system. Not everything was there. Most of the sale proceeds were in accounts managed by my financial team, but enough to give me a clear picture of what anyone looking in from the outside would be trying to reach. The number was significant, the kind of number that could change the trajectory of more than one person's life. I found something that stopped me cold. In the back of the third drawer of the filing cabinet, the one I rarely opened because it held older records, things from the years before I had digitized everything, I found a folder that wasn't in my handwriting. The label said Medical Assessment, E. Hartwell, Preliminary. Inside was a document, 2 pages, printed rather than handwritten, dated 6 weeks ago. It appeared to be notes from a cognitive assessment. It referred to a patient identified only as E.H., female, age 72. It described observable memory lapses, difficulty maintaining conversational thread, reduced capacity for complex financial reasoning, and increasing emotional volatility. I read it twice, then 3 times. None of it was true. I knew none of it was true. I had my own doctors, my own medical records, a complete and current assessment from 6 months ago that said exactly the opposite of everything in these pages. But that was almost irrelevant because the document existed. It was in my house, in my files, labeled with my initial. And if it had ever been submitted to a court without my knowledge, without my attorney present to challenge it, it would have been one piece of a much larger fabricated picture. I didn't know yet whose signature was on it. I couldn't make out the name. But I photographed it with my phone. Both pages, careful to get the date and the letterhead, and I added it to a folder I had started labeling, in my mind, as the case, because that was what it was now. Not a family crisis, a case. When you have been in business long enough, you learn that the moment emotion stops being useful, you have to set it down temporarily and pick up something colder. Not forever, just long enough to do what needs to be done. Grief and fury and betrayal were all real, and I would give them their due. But not yet. Not while there was still work to do. I poured a second cup of coffee and sat back down at my desk. By 7 in the morning, I had a list of 12 things I needed to do. By 8, I had done 4 of them. By 9, Marcus answered his office phone on the first ring, and when I told him about the Prescott and Dulanne connection to Sycamore Ridge and about the folder in my filing cabinet, there was a silence on his end that told me he was recalibrating how serious this was. "Evelyn," he said, "how soon can you come in?" "I can be there in an hour," I said. "Good. And bring everything, the photograph, the notes, everything." "I know," I said. "I already put it in a bag." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something he had never said to me in 11 years of professional relationship. "I'm sorry this is happening to you." "Don't be sorry," I said. "Be good at your job." "Yes," he said. "I can do that." I hung up. I sat for one more moment in my study, in the particular quiet of early morning, with my coffee going cold beside me and the folder of photographs on the desk in front of me, and everything I had spent 40 years building arranged around me like something I had not yet decided whether to fight for or let go. I already knew the answer. I had known it since the moment I sat in that hospital chair and chose silence over reaction, since the moment I photographed those 2 pages at 5 in the morning, since the moment I watched Clara's eyes find the documents beside my chair and told myself to pay attention. I was going to fight, not because of the money. The money was real, and protecting it was legitimate, but if it had been only about money, I might have let some of it go. I was 72. I didn't need all of it. What I needed was what the money represented. The evidence, in concrete and irrefutable form, that I had mattered, that the years had added up to something, that the company and the contracts and the sleepless decades and the silent dinners and the missed school plays and the grinding, dignified effort of building something where nothing existed before, that all of it had meant something real. To let them take it without a fight would have been to agree with what they believed about me, that I was finished, that I was over, that I was the kind of woman who could be managed, redirected, archived. I was not that woman. I had never been that woman, and they had made the particular mistake of reminding me of that at exactly the moment I needed reminding. I picked up my bag. I put on my coat. I stepped out into the cold morning air and got in my car and drove toward Marcus Vale's office. And the whole way there, I was already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way I had always thought, the way that had kept me in the game long past the point when most people had decided I should leave it. They thought they had built a trap. They hadn't. They had built a starting point. Marcus Vale's office was on the 14th floor of a building that had no personality whatsoever from the outside. Gray glass, gray steel, the kind of architecture that communicated competence without warmth. But inside, his particular corner of it had the quality of a room that had absorbed decades of serious conversation. Books on 3 walls, a desk that was always more organized than it appeared, 2 chairs across from it that were comfortable in the way that said someone had thought carefully about the fact that the people sitting in them were usually having the worst weeks of their lives. I had sat in those chairs many times, never for anything like this. Marcus was already standing when his assistant showed me in. He took the bag from my hand before I had finished saying good morning, set it on the desk, and said, "Coffee's there. Sit down. Start from the beginning. I already told you most of it last night. Tell me again. In daylight. With everything in front of us." I sat down. I told him again. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without writing anything down immediately, just taking it in with that quality of attention that made you feel, even in the middle of a crisis, that you were being heard precisely. When I finished, he opened the bag and looked at the photographs I had taken of the fabricated assessment document. He was quiet for a long time. "This is a forgery," he finally said. "I know. A sophisticated one. Someone had access to legitimate medical letterhead or had it replicated closely enough to pass initial review." He set the photographs down and looked at me. "The name of the evaluating physician is partially obscured here, intentionally, I think. But the facility letterhead at the top is visible." He turned the photograph toward me and pointed. "Linden Grove Behavioral Health. Do you recognize that name?" I looked at it. I did not recognize it. I said so. Marcus turned back to his computer and typed for a moment. "Linden Grove Behavioral Health is a private outpatient clinic. It's been operating for about 4 years. It has no significant online footprint, no reviews, no complaints with the state medical board, no staff listed publicly. That's unusual for a legitimate clinic." He turned the screen toward me. The website was spare. Clinical. Photographs of an interior that looked assembled rather than lived in. "What's interesting is the registered agent for Linden Grove." "Prescott and Dulane," I said. He nodded. "Same legal address?" I sat back in the chair. "So the clinic that produced the fake assessment is registered through the same firm that was going to file for my guardianship." "That's what it looks like, which means this isn't just a family dispute over estate documents. This is an organized scheme, multiple entities, coordinated activity, possibly over a substantial period of time." He folded his hands on the desk. "Evelyn, I have to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me without managing the answer. Ask. Is there any possibility Daniel is involved?" I had been waiting for that question since 2 in the morning. I had turned it over so many times in the dark that the edges of it were worn smooth. "I don't know," I said. "I genuinely don't know, and I'm aware that I don't know is not the same as no." Marcus absorbed that without judgment. Then we proceed carefully. We build the case against what we can prove, and we let the truth about Daniel emerge from the evidence rather than from assumption. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly how we proceed." He picked up his phone and made a call. The person he reached was a private investigator named Dara Chin. "The best in the city," he said, not as a sales pitch but as a statement of logistics. And within 15 minutes, she was on speakerphone asking me questions that were precise and unsentimental and made me feel, for the first time since the previous evening, that I was not alone in this particular room. The next 72 hours were the longest of my life since Gerald's illness, and they had a similar quality. That suspended, disoriented feeling of time moving at the wrong speed, of your ordinary life continuing in your peripheral vision while something enormous occupied the center of your attention. I went home. I slept for 4 hours badly. I answered Daniel's texts with the kind of measured, warm responses that gave nothing away. He said Clara was recovering well. He said the doctors thought it might have been a contamination at the restaurant, that they were looking into it. He said he was sorry the evening had ended the way it did. I said I was glad she was feeling better. I said we would talk soon. Every word of it cost something. Dara Chin was fast. I had not known what to expect. I had never hired a private investigator before, had never had cause to, but she operated with an efficiency that was almost startling. Within 48 hours, she had mapped the relationships between Clara, Prescott, and Dulaine, Linden Grove Behavioral Health, and a third entity I had not encountered yet, a financial management company called Viridian Asset Partners. Viridian Asset Partners had been incorporated 14 months ago. Its listed director of client services was a man named Glenn Morrow. Glenn Morrow, Dara discovered, had been Clara's boyfriend for 3 years before she married Daniel. He was not, as far as the public record showed, currently in contact with Clara, but his cell phone had been in contact with hers, according to records obtained through means Dara declined to specify, but which Marcus confirmed were legally obtained. 47 times in the 6 months preceding the dinner at Aldrich and Pine. 47 times. I sat with that number in Marcus's office on the third morning and felt something I had not expected to feel. A cold, quiet fury that had nothing to do with money or legal strategy. It had to do with the sheer volume of invisible labor that had gone into dismantling me. 47 phone calls. A fake clinic. A fabricated assessment placed in my own filing cabinet. A compound obtained and administered in a restaurant. A legal firm on standby. A financial management company waiting to absorb the assets once the guardianship was granted. They had been building this for over a year. While I was finalizing the sale of my company, while I was sitting in conference rooms signing the papers that represented the work of my entire adult life, while I was going to sleep at night believing that the most complicated thing ahead of me was deciding how to use the time I had finally earned, they had been building a machine to take everything from me. How did the document get into my filing cabinet? I asked Dara, when she laid out the full picture. Clara had access to your home on at least 6 documented occasions in the last 4 months, she said. Dara was compact and precise, with the quality of someone who had trained herself never to waste a word. You gave her a key after Daniel's surgery last year, when she was helping coordinate care. I had forgotten about that key. The surgery had been minor, an outpatient procedure, nothing serious, and I had given her the key so she could drop off meals on days I couldn't leave the office. I had never asked for it back because it had seemed like such a small thing. She made a copy, I said, almost certainly. And the compound, the drug. Morrow has a contact in pharmaceutical research. We're still tracing the specific chain, but the compound itself appears to have been sourced through a private lab with loose oversight. Morrow paid for it. We have the financial trail. She paused. Partially, enough to make it compelling. I thought about Glenn Morrow, whom I had never met, who had spent 14 months building a company designed to absorb my wealth, who had provided the chemical tool for the scheme while staying invisible behind a relationship that officially didn't exist anymore. He's the one who actually sourced the drug, I said. That's what the evidence suggests. Which means he faces criminal exposure. Significant criminal exposure, yes. Conspiracy, fraud, potentially attempted poisoning depending on how the DA characterizes intent. Dara folded her hands, which also means he has a very strong incentive to cooperate if given the opportunity. I looked at Marcus. Marcus was already nodding slowly. If Morrow flips, we don't need to build the case piece by piece. He becomes the piece that connects everything. What? The decision to approach Morrow was not easy and was not mine alone. Marcus spent the better part of a day consulting with a colleague who had experience in white-collar criminal cases, a sharp-edged woman named Patricia Osai, who wore glasses on a chain and spoke in sentences so precise they felt almost architectural. She agreed that Morrow was the weakest structural element, the one most likely to break under the specific pressure of criminal liability, and that the right kind of approach, made through proper legal channels, could unlock the entire case. What made it complicated was timing. We could not move too soon. Clara didn't know yet that the scheme had failed in any permanent way. As far as she knew, the drug had simply affected the wrong person through some unforeseen circumstance. She didn't know about Dara. She didn't know about the photographs of the fabricated assessment. She didn't know that Marcus had already spoken to a former colleague in the district attorney's office about potential avenues for a criminal referral. She was at home, recovering, presumably regrouping with Morrow and Prescott and Dulaine about how to adjust the approach. That window of her not knowing was precious. It was the only real advantage we had. "We need her to take one more step," Marcus said, "something overt. Something that's unambiguously part of the conspiracy rather than just preparation for it." "You want her to make a move on the guardianship," I said. "I want her to initiate something formal. A court filing, a medical referral through Linden Grove, a meeting with Prescott and Dulaine that we can document." He looked at me carefully. "Which means you need to give her a reason to believe the original plan is still viable." "You want me to pretend?" I said. "I want you to be strategic." He leaned forward slightly. "You said she came across as concerned at the hospital, that she's maintaining the caring daughter-in-law posture." "Yes." "Then maintain the corresponding posture on your end. Let her believe you're tired, that you're overwhelmed, that the events of the past week have shaken you more than you're letting Daniel see." He paused. "You don't have to do anything dishonest. Just stop correcting her impression." I thought about that. About the performance it would require, not of distress exactly, but of a particular kind of vulnerability. The vulnerability that Clara had been counting on. The trembling older woman who needed managing. Every part of me resisted it. "I know," Marcus said, reading my face. "I know what I'm asking." "Do it for 1 week," Patricia Osei said from across the table, her glasses down on her nose. "Evelyn, I've seen cases like this collapse because the target tipped their hand too soon. 1 week of strategic patience is the difference between a civil case and a criminal one, between an apology and a consequence." I looked at the table, at the photographs and the documents and the financial records spread across it, at the name Glenn Morrow written in Dara's precise handwriting on a legal pad, with 47 next to it in a circle. 1 week, I said. It was the strangest week of my life. I called Daniel on Tuesday and told him I hadn't been sleeping well. I said the events at the restaurant had shaken me more than I expected. I said I was thinking about whether I needed to simplify some things in my life, that perhaps I had been carrying too much for too long. I said it all in a careful, slightly tired voice that wasn't entirely a performance. I was tired, genuinely bone-tired in the way that only happens when the thing exhausting you is not work, but the sustained effort of containing enormous feeling in a small, functional space. Daniel said he and Clara would like to come by the house on Thursday. He said Clara wanted to cook dinner. She'd been feeling so much better, wanted to do something nice. He said it gently, the way you say something to a person you're worried about, and I didn't know whether the worry was real or whether it was, and this was the thought I couldn't fully form without it hurting, part of something he was managing. I said Thursday was fine. On Wednesday, Dara confirmed that Prescott and Dulaine had filed a preliminary court document, not a guardianship petition yet, but a notice of intent to petition, which was a procedural step that put the court on notice without triggering immediate proceedings. It had been filed under a case number assigned to a proceeding identified as INRI Evelyn Marie Hartwell. The supporting documentation cited the fabricated Linden Grove assessment and 2 other documents I had never seen before, a letter from a family member expressing concern about my mental state, and a declaration from an unnamed physician stating he had observed signs of cognitive decline during a recent interaction. The family member letter was unsigned in the version Prescott and Dulaine had filed. Marcus said that was intentional at this stage. It would be identified as the case progressed. But the unnamed physician who had provided the declaration, that was different. That was someone willing to attach his professional standing to a lie, and that was someone Marcus could pursue. "Who is he?" I asked. "We think it's a Dr. Raymond Tull," Marcus said. "He's licensed, but his license has been on administrative review for the past 18 months for unrelated conduct issues. He works primarily with Linden Grove." He looked at me steadily. "He's the one who co-signed the assessment found in your filing cabinet." I thought of Dr. Fenwick at the hospital, who had chosen his words carefully and directed his explanation at my son. I thought of the difference between a doctor who was awkward and a doctor who was compromised, and how, from the outside, that difference was nearly invisible. "Can he be flipped like Morrow?" I asked. "He might not need to be," Patricia Osei said. "The administrative review means he's already in a precarious position. If we present him with the full picture of his exposure, criminal fraud, conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, he may decide that cooperation is the only viable path before we even have to ask." Elder abuse. The phrase moved through me strangely. I understood it precisely, knew exactly which statute it invoked and why it applied. But hearing it said out loud applied to me was different from knowing it intellectually. "That's what it is," I said. "Isn't it?" "Yes," Patricia said, not apologetically, just clearly. "That's what it is." Thursday dinner was the most difficult thing I had done in years. Clara cooked pasta, a simple dish, competently made, the kind of meal that communicated effort without ostentation. She moved around my kitchen with a familiarity that I realized, watching her, had been built deliberately. She knew where things were. She had made herself at home, slowly, visit by visit, over the past 6 months. That familiarity had once felt like warmth. Now it felt like reconnaissance. Daniel opened wine. The three of us sat around the table in my dining room and ate, and the conversation was careful on all sides in a way that would have looked, to any outside observer, like a family being gentle with each other after a hard week. Clara asked how I was sleeping. I said not well, but that I was managing. She said that was understandable, that I'd been through so much. I agreed that I had. Daniel talked about work, about a project that was going better than expected, about a weekend trip they were considering. Clara asked, somewhere around the second glass of wine, whether I had thought any more about my estate planning. She asked it lightly, the way you ask a question you've been carrying for a while but have been waiting for the right moment to raise. "A little," I said. "It's just, after everything that happened at the restaurant, I've been thinking." She set down her fork. Her face arranged itself into an expression of careful, layered concern. It was genuinely impressive. "You handle so much on your own, Evelyn. The accounts, the investments, the legal documents. And I know you have Marcus, but Marcus is, he's wonderful, but he's managing things from the outside. He doesn't know your day-to-day. He doesn't know when you seem tired or when you've mentioned forgetting something or when I seem like I'm declining," I said. A pause. Very slight. "I wouldn't have put it that way." "How would you put it?" She looked at Daniel. He looked at his plate briefly, then back at her, then at me. "Mom, you're worried about me," I said. "I understand that." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her touch was warm. Her eyes were precisely calibrated, soft, patient, just this side of sad. "We love you," she said. "We just want what's best." I looked at her hand on mine. I thought about 47 phone calls in a compound sourced through a private lab and a fake assessment in my filing cabinet and a facility with watercolor painting and chair yoga. I thought about the word guardianship and the word decline and the particular word love, which she was using as though it were a universal solvent, as though it could dissolve the infrastructure of what she had built by simply being said. I turned my hand over and patted hers. "I know you do," I said. I was proud of myself for that, not because it was easy, because it was necessary, and because I did it without my voice shaking, without my eyes giving anything away, without letting even a fraction of what I actually felt surface in my face. One more day. That was what Marcus had told me that morning. We needed one more day for a piece of evidence Dara was close to confirming, something that would make the case not just strong, but airtight. One more day. I could do one more day. The piece of evidence Dara confirmed the following afternoon was this. A wire transfer of $48,000 from an account in Glenn Morrow's name to a personal account registered to Dr. Raymond Tull. The transfer had been made 11 weeks earlier, weeks before the dinner at Aldrich and Pine, and it was the payment for the fabricated assessment. Tull had been paid in advance to produce a document that didn't reflect any actual examination, had never been part of any legitimate clinical record, and had been planted in my filing cabinet to serve as foundational evidence for a fraudulent guardianship petition. When Marcus presented Dr. Tull with that wire transfer record, Tull, according to Marcus, who described the meeting with the spare language of someone who had witnessed many people crumble but still found it notable, stopped being a person who needed to be convinced and became a person who needed a deal. He gave them everything: the names, the timeline, the specific instructions he had received, the conversation in which Clara had described the drug plan and asked him to have the assessment ready for filing within a week of the dinner. He said he had not known, initially, that a drug would be involved. He said he had thought it was simply a matter of documentation, that there were family concerns about an elderly woman's mental state, that he was being asked to formalize what was already being observed. I did not believe him on that last point. I thought he had known more than he admitted, and that the part he was willing to admit was the part that made him sound least culpable. But it didn't matter what I believed. What mattered was what he was willing to say under oath, and under oath he was willing to say enough. That same afternoon, Marcus filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office. The charges included conspiracy to commit fraud, financial elder abuse, tampering with legal proceedings, and administering a controlled substance without consent. The complaint named Clara Whitmore Hartwell, Glenn Morrow, Raymond Tull, and 2 senior partners at Prescott and Dulane. It did not name Daniel. There was not, at this point, evidence sufficient to name Daniel, but Marcus told me quietly, as we sat in his office after the filing, that the investigation would look at everyone whose communications touched the conspiracy. If Daniel had known and said nothing, that would be for the DA's office to determine. It was not within our control anymore. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked. He asked it the way a good attorney asks, not wanting an emotional answer, just wanting to take the temperature before the next hard thing arrived. "I feel like it's not over," I said. "It's not," he agreed. "But the worst part is." I wasn't sure that was true. The worst part, to me, was not the legal machinery or the evidence or the forthcoming proceedings. The worst part was still the Thursday dinner. The worst part was Clara's hand on mine and the word love in her mouth. The worst part was the question I still couldn't answer about my son. That evening, Daniel called me. His voice was different, stripped of the careful warmth it had carried all week. He sounded, when I answered, like someone who had just been told something that had rearranged his understanding of his own life. "They came to the house," he said. 2 investigators from the DA's office. They had questions about Clara, about things I didn't know about, Mom. Things that... He stopped. I could hear him breathing. "Is this why you called me on Tuesday? About the sleeping? About being overwhelmed? Was that... Daniel, I need you to tell me what's happening." I sat down on the edge of my bed. Outside, the evening light was doing the particular thing it did in late autumn, turning everything amber and then gray in a matter of minutes, like a slow exhale. I looked at the window for a moment. "Come to Marcus's office tomorrow morning," I said. "I'll tell you everything." "Mom, tomorrow," I said. "Tonight, I need you to think about what you know and what you don't know and what the difference is between those 2 things. Can you do that?" A long silence. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "Good." After I hung up, I sat for a while longer on the edge of the bed. I thought about what it was going to look like in that office the next morning. My son, hearing the full account of what his wife had built, the timeline, the fabricated document in my filing cabinet, the $48,000 wire transfer, the 47 phone calls. I didn't know how it was going to land. I didn't know what he would say or whether what he said would match what was true. I had given him the benefit of a doubt I wasn't certain he deserved, and tomorrow I was going to find out whether that doubt had been correctly placed. Whatever he said, I was going to have to live with knowing. Some losses don't announce themselves clearly. They arrive the same way the scheme had arrived, slowly, in increments, each piece small enough to dismiss until one day You look at the whole assembled thing and understand that something you counted on is gone. I got up. I went to the window. I looked out at the amber-going gray of the evening, and I said out loud, to no one, in the quiet of a house that had always been more empty than I let myself admit, "You're still here." It wasn't a comfort exactly, but it was true. And in my experience, true had always been the better foundation. The court date was set for 3 weeks from Thursday. Whatever happened in Marcus's office tomorrow morning, whatever Daniel said or didn't say, the case was moving now. It had its own momentum. The trap that had been built around me was dismantled, its pieces cataloged and photographed and filed in a court document bearing my name, not as the subject of a competency proceeding, but as the complainant. Evelyn Marie Hartwell, complainant. I held that for a moment. Then I turned off the light and went to get ready for whatever came next. Daniel arrived at Marcus's office at 9 in the morning looking like a man who had not slept. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the expression on his face, not the way he held himself, but the specific texture of exhaustion that was written into the skin around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the slightly uncoordinated way he moved through the door that told me he had been awake most of the night doing exactly what I had asked him to do, thinking about what he knew and what he didn't know, and what the difference was between those two things. He sat down in the chair across from Marcus's desk. I was already there, in the chair beside him. He looked at me for a moment, just looked without saying anything, and then he looked at the document spread across the desk in front of us, and I watched his face do something complicated and private that I didn't fully have words for. Marcus gave him time. That was one of the things Marcus was genuinely good at, knowing when to let a room breathe. "Start wherever you need to start," Marcus said. Daniel looked at his hands in his lap. "She told me it was estate planning," he said, "that we needed to start thinking about it, that people our age, people mom's age, sometimes get to a point where the paperwork becomes overwhelming, and that having family more involved was better than leaving everything to attorneys and financial managers who didn't know her personally." He paused. "She made it sound like care." "When did those conversations start?" Marcus asked. "About 8 months ago, maybe 9. He exhaled. "Around the time the MedTech sale was announced." The timing landed in the room without comment. It didn't need comment. "Did she ever mention Prescott and Dulaine?" Marcus asked. "No." "Linden Grove Behavioral Health?" A slight pause. "No, I've never heard that name." "Glen Morrow?" And there it was. A hesitation so brief that if I had not been watching my son's face with the particular attention of a mother who had spent 51 years learning to read him, I might have missed it. A fractional pause, a micro-tension in the muscles of his jaw before he said, "That's someone Clara knew before we were together." "You knew about their prior relationship," Marcus said. "Yes. She mentioned him early on, said they'd dated for a couple of years, that it ended badly. She didn't talk about him after that." Daniel looked up. "Why is his name on those documents?" Marcus turned one of the financial records toward him. The wire transfer, $48,000. Glen Morrow to Raymond Tull. Because he was the operational center of the scheme. He sourced the compound used at the restaurant. He funded the fabricated medical assessment. He incorporated the financial management company that was structured to receive your mother's assets once the guardianship was granted. Daniel looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. "The relationship didn't end," I said, quietly. Not as an accusation, just as the truth that needed to be in the room. "They've been in contact throughout your marriage, 47 documented communications in the 6 months before the dinner alone." My son's face did something then that I had not seen it do since his father died. It didn't crumple. Daniel was not a man who crumpled. He had learned that from me whether I had intended to teach it or not. But something behind his eyes went very still, the way water goes still before it freezes. I watched him absorb it. I watched him take the shape of what he was being told and hold it against what he had believed for however many years he had believed it, and I watched the collision happen silently, internally, in the space of about 15 seconds. "She used me," he said. Not a question. "I think so," I said. "Yes." "To get access to you, to your house, to your documents." He was speaking slowly, carefully, the way you speak when you're building something as you say it, when the words are the first place the understanding is taking shape. "The key." She asked me to suggest giving her the key after my surgery. I thought it was her idea to be helpful. She said she wanted to look after things while you were busy. He stopped. I thought she was being kind. I know. I told you she was a good person. His voice shifted on that, not cracked, but changed, like a note played slightly off pitch. I sat in the car outside your house, and I told you she was a good person. Daniel, I defended her to you. I made you feel like your instincts were... He stopped again. His hand went to his forehead briefly, pressed there, came away. Mom, I'm sorry. There were things I wanted to say to him in that moment that I couldn't say in Marcus's office, in front of documents and legal strategy. There were things that belonged in a different room, a different conversation, one that didn't have a case file on the table between us. So I said the thing that was true and that he needed to hear and that could be said here. I know you didn't know. You don't know that. I know you well enough. He looked at me, his father's jaw, my mother's eyes. How can you be... Because if you had known, I said, you would not have been able to sit across from me at that dinner table and do what you did. You're not that good a liar, Daniel. You never have been. Since you were 12 years old, you could not tell me an untruth without something in your face giving it away. I paused. Nothing gave it away that night. What I saw in your face was confusion, and confusion is not the same as complicity. He was quiet for a while. What happens now? He finally asked Marcus. The criminal proceedings move forward, Marcus said. Your wife will be arraigned within the week. The others, Morrow, Toll, the Prescott partners, are already in the process of being charged. Clara will need her own attorney. Whatever you decide about the marriage, you should make that decision independent of the legal proceedings. He paused. And you should get your own attorney as well. Not because you're under investigation, you're not, but because your interests need to be represented separately from everyone else's in this. Daniel nodded. He was absorbing it the way you absorb something that is too large to take in all at once, in pieces, accepting each piece before moving to the next. She's going to call me, he said. She's going to ask me to... Don't take her calls without your attorney present, Marcus said. I know that sounds harsh, but she is now a defendant in a criminal case, and anything you say to her can be subpoenaed. Something moved across my son's face. Not anger exactly, something older and sadder and more complicated than anger. She's still my wife. I know, Marcus said. I know she is. The three of us sat with that for a moment. The particular weight of it, the legal reality and the human reality occupying the same room, pulling in different directions, neither of them untrue. Cute. The 3 weeks before the court date were not quiet. I had expected them to be. I had expected, having filed the complaint and set the machinery in motion, to move into a period of waiting. That was not what happened. What happened was a series of smaller collisions, each one arriving before I had fully absorbed the last. Clara hired an attorney, a man named Foster Reed, who had a reputation for aggressive procedural maneuvering and who filed 3 separate motions in the first week designed to suppress evidence, challenge the admissibility of Tull's cooperation agreement, and delay the proceedings on grounds that the original criminal complaint had been filed with procedural deficiencies. Marcus responded to all 3 efficiently and without drama, which was one of the things I paid him for, but the motions themselves were a signal. Clara was not going to accept the situation. She was going to fight, and she was going to fight the way she had always operated, by attacking the structure of the case rather than its substance, by trying to make the process expensive and exhausting enough that I might decide, somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd continuance, that it wasn't worth it. She had miscalculated again the particular quality of my endurance. Glenn Morrow retained his own attorney and within 4 days indicated through that attorney that he was willing to expand his cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge. The DA's office accepted. His statement, when it was filed, was detailed and specific in ways that removed any ambiguity about the timeline and the intent. He described in clinical legal language that somehow managed to be more devastating for its plainness, the sequence of conversations in which Clara had outlined the plan, the initial concept, the research into guardianship law, the decision to involve Prescott and Dulaine, the approach to Tull, the sourcing of the compound. He described a specific conversation, dated, with location, with corroborating phone records, in which Clara had said that Evelyn Hartwell was not going to simply hand anything over, so the approach had to be medical and legal, not personal. Not going to simply hand anything over. She had understood me that precisely, had known that a direct approach, simply asking for access to the estate, trying to position herself as a formal co-manager, would not have worked, had known that the only way to take what she wanted from me was to first take me, to erase my competence, my credibility, my legal standing as a person capable of making her own decisions. She had looked at a 72-year-old woman who had built a company from nothing and sold it for a fortune and thought, the only way through her is around her, and she had spent 14 months building the around. When Marcus read me that section of Morrow's statement, I sat very still for a moment. Then I said, she understood me better than most people I've worked with for years. Marcus looked at me with a slightly complicated expression. Is that a compliment? No. I folded my hands. It's an observation. Understanding someone's strengths well enough to design a workaround for them is not the same as respecting those strengths. It's the opposite. I paused. She saw what I was and treated it as an obstacle. He was quiet for a moment. Do you want to see the full statement? Yes, I said. All of it. He passed it across the desk, and I read every page. Sat. Daniel called me every 2 days during those 3 weeks. The calls were short, 15, 20 minutes, and they had the quality of a person checking in on someone while simultaneously keeping themselves afloat. He was living in an extended stay hotel. He had consulted an attorney, as Marcus suggested. He had not spoken to Clara directly since the investigators came to the house, though she had attempted contact multiple times through channels her attorney should have advised her to avoid. He didn't tell me what he was going to do about the marriage. I didn't ask. That was his territory. And the most important thing I had learned in 51 years of being someone's mother was that there were spaces inside your children's lives that did not belong to you, no matter how much you loved them or how clearly you could see the shape of the thing they were deciding. What he did tell me on one of those calls was something that I turned over in my mind for days afterward. I found something, he said. Going through the house, our house, while Clara's been staying at her sister's. I was looking for some financial documents I needed for my attorney, and I found a folder in the back of her closet. What kind of folder? Notes, research, about you. He paused. About your health, your routines, your financial accounts, your relationships with your doctors, names of your investment managers. A copy of your old will. I don't know how she got it. Marcus said it might have been from something you signed years ago that she photographed. There were notes about your sleeping patterns, whether you'd mentioned forgetting things, whether you'd repeated yourself in conversation. His voice was level, but barely. She was keeping records, Mom. Like a file. Like you were a project. I was silent for a moment. How long? I finally asked. The earliest notes are dated about 2 years ago. 2 years. Before the MedTech sale was even announced. Before the final negotiations, before the due diligence rounds, before the ink on the transaction documents. She had started building her file on me 2 years before the dinner at Aldrich and Pine. Daniel, I said. Yeah. Give that folder to your attorney and have it transmitted to Marcus today. I already did. Good. I paused. Are you all right? The question was inadequate. I knew it was inadequate even as I asked it, but it was what I had, and he received it the way he had always received inadequate questions from me, with a patience that was also a kind of forgiveness. I'm working on it, he said, but the night before the court date, I could not sleep again, but this time it was different from the sleeplessness of those first nights after the restaurant. Those nights had been filled with a churning, compressed energy, the need to act, to document, to plan, to stay several moves ahead. This sleeplessness was quieter, almost reflective. I sat in my study at the scarred desk with a cup of tea I had made and mostly let go cold, and I thought about the shape of what I was walking into the next morning. Not the legal mechanics. I had been over those with Marcus until I knew them the way I knew my own company's financials. But the human shape of it, The fact that tomorrow I would sit in a courtroom and watch the formal unraveling of something that had once looked, from the outside, like family. I thought about Clara in her cream-colored dress. I thought about the specific skill required to perform that kind of warmth, to look at a person and make them feel seen while you were actually cataloging them, to say we love you while operating a 14-month infrastructure designed to strip them of their identity and their autonomy. That skill was real, regardless of its purpose. It had been used against me. It had been used against my son. And somewhere behind it was a person who had at some point decided that the normal routes, work, patience, building something of your own, were less viable than finding someone else's something and taking it. I didn't hate her. That surprised me, honestly. I had expected to discover hatred somewhere in myself by now, and instead what I found was something more like the kind of tired clarity you arrive at after you've been very angry for a very long time and the anger has finally burned through to the other side. What she had done was wrong, specifically, deliberately, elaborately wrong, and she was going to face the consequences of that, not because I was powerful and she had underestimated me, though both of those things were true, but because what she had built was a crime, and crimes, when documented and presented clearly, tend to find their consequences. But the person who had decided to build it, who had looked at her life and decided that taking was the strategy, I didn't know enough about that person to hate her. I knew the plan. I knew the methodology. I didn't know the moment she had become someone who thought this way, and I suspected that moment was probably not as dramatic or as clear as the scheme itself. People didn't usually arrive at this kind of thing in a single terrible decision. They arrived at it in increments, the same way they arrived at everything else. That didn't excuse it. I want to be precise about that. Understanding something is not the same as forgiving it, and forgiveness was not what I was sitting with at my desk the night before the trial. What I was sitting with was the awareness that I was going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow, not as a victim, but as a complainant. Not as an elderly woman who had almost been erased, but as the person who had documented the erasure and chosen to answer it. That distinction mattered to me. It had mattered from the beginning, in the hospital corridor, in the specific way I had chosen to stand before going back to the waiting room. I was not what they had tried to make me. I had never been. The courtroom was wood-paneled and insufficiently heated and smelled the way all courtrooms smell, like paper and old argument. Marcus had been in this particular room before. He moved through it with the ease of familiarity, exchanging a brief word with the clerk, setting his files on the table with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this enough times to have stopped being nervous about the room itself. I wore a charcoal gray suit that I had owned for 12 years. It was well made and simple, and it fit the way clothes fit when you've stopped buying things to impress people and started buying them to last. I had chosen it deliberately, not to perform severity, but because I wanted to wear something that had been with me through other serious days and had not let me down. Clara was already seated at the defendant's table when I came in. She was wearing black, a choice that read from the outside as either appropriate solemnity or calculated sympathy-seeking, and I suspected it was the latter. Her attorney, Foster Reed, was beside her. He was a large man who projected confidence the way some buildings project size, through sheer volume rather than through any particular quality. He was shuffling papers with the performative busyness of someone who wanted the room to see how prepared he was. Clara did not look at me when I entered. That was interesting. She had looked at me every other time we had been in a room together, always with the camera-ready expression, always with the warmth that was actually surveillance. Not looking was a different choice. I didn't know yet whether it was strategic or whether it was the first genuine emotion I had ever seen from her. The specific shame of being seen clearly by the person you thought you had been seeing. I sat down. Marcus sat beside me. Patricia Osei was at an adjacent table, conferring quietly with the assistant district attorney. The room filled gradually. Court officials, stenographer, a handful of observers I didn't recognize, and then Daniel, who came in from the back and sat in the row directly behind me and put his hand briefly on my shoulder without saying anything. I reached up and pressed his hand once. Then the judge came in, and the room stood, and everything became formal and procedural and moved at the particular pace of legal proceedings, which is to say, slowly, methodically, with none of the dramatic tempo of the weeks that had preceded it, and all the more consequential for that. Foster Reed's opening was aggressive in the way I had expected. He characterized the case as a misunderstanding between family members, a well-intentioned concern for an aging relative that had been catastrophically misrepresented by a bitter and litigious complainant. He used the word complainant with a specific inflection, as though it were something slightly distasteful. He described Clara as a devoted daughter-in-law who had only ever wanted to protect her husband's mother. He described Glenn Morrow as a disgruntled former associate, whose testimony was motivated by his own plea arrangement rather than any truthful account of events. He was good, I won't pretend otherwise. He was professionally skilled at making a clean story out of complicated facts, and I watched two members of the gallery nodding slightly at certain points in his opening, which told me that the story was landing for some people. Then Marcus stood up. Marcus Vail did not have Foster Reed's volume. He was not a large presence attorney. He was a precise one. He spoke quietly enough that the room had to lean slightly toward him, which meant the room was paying attention in a different way, actively rather than passively receiving. He said, "What the defense has described as a family misunderstanding is, in fact, a 14-month conspiracy that involved a fabricated medical document, a sourced controlled substance, a shell clinic, a standby financial management company, and 47 documented communications between the defendant and her co-conspirator during the 6 months immediately preceding the attempt. We will present each of these elements in sequence. We will show the court not just what happened on the evening of the dinner at Aldrich and Pine, but the full architecture of what had been built in advance of that evening, by whom, over what period of time, and with what specific intent. The picture that emerges will not be ambiguous." He sat down. Clara's hands, I noticed, were flat on the table in front of her, very still, the stillness of something held down. The first 2 days of testimony were methodical. Darachin presented the financial records and communication logs with the dry precision of someone who understood that the most devastating evidence was usually also the most boring to present, because boring meant unimpeachable, meant documented, meant not a story, but a record. The wire transfer, the phone records, the incorporation documents for Viridian Asset Partners, the partnership listing between Linden Grove and Prescott and Dulane. Foster Reed cross-examined her for most of an afternoon, and he was skilled at finding edges, small inconsistencies in dates, gaps in the chain of custody for certain documents, places where the connection between entities required an inferential step rather than a direct document trail. Dara handled it without irritation and without retreat, which was the right way to handle it, because irritation would have made her look defensive, and retreat would have made the edges look larger than they were. Raymond Toll testified on the third day. He was not impressive on the stand. He was a slight man who had probably once carried himself with the authority of his medical credentials and was now carrying the considerably heavier weight of what those credentials had been used to do. He answered questions in a voice that didn't always reach the back of the room, and he had the quality of someone who had made a series of decisions he understood to be wrong while making them, but had found ways to justify until the justifications ran out. He described the fabricated assessment in technical detail. He described receiving the instructions. He described being told what the document needed to say, what it needed to imply, how it needed to be structured to survive initial legal review. He described accepting $48,000 to produce it. Foster Reed's cross-examination attempted to characterize Toll as the primary villain, a corrupt physician who had acted independently, whose testimony was self-serving, whose account of receiving instructions from Clara was convenient. Toll, to his credit, did not flinch from the self-serving part. "Yes," he said at one point when Reed pressed him, "I am cooperating in exchange for a reduced charge. That's accurate. It doesn't change what happened." It was possibly the most honest thing he said on the stand. And it landed, I thought, with the specific weight that honest things sometimes have in rooms designed for argument. Glenn Morrow testified on day 4. He was different from Toll, more composed, more practiced, with the quality of a man who had spent years navigating situations that required a certain agility. He knew how to present information in a way that was technically factual while managing his own image. And Foster Reed worked hard to expose that management. But the core of what Morrow said, the timeline, the conversations, the specific statements Claire had made about the plan, was consistent with the documentary evidence in ways that made it impossible to dismiss as fabrication. The most important moment came when Patricia Osei, redirecting after Reed's Cross, asked Morrow about a specific conversation. A dinner meeting, 4 months before Aldrich and Pine, at a restaurant in the northern part of the city. She read back his statement about that conversation and asked him to confirm it. He confirmed it. The statement described Clara saying, in relation to my estate, she built it, so she holds on to it like it's her identity. The only way to separate her from it is to separate her from herself first. Separate her from herself. The phrase moved through the courtroom with a particular quietness. No one gasped, no one reacted visibly. But I felt something change in the temperature of the room, the way you feel pressure change before weather, because those 6 words did something that 4 days of financial records and forensic testimony had not quite done. They made the intent of the scheme legible, not as fraud or conspiracy, but as something more personal. Something that was specifically about who I was and what that meant for how they had to come at me. She had understood that the money and I were not separate things, and so she had designed a plan to separate them for us. I sat very still and I listened to the silence after those words, and I thought, there it is. That was the truth at the center of everything. Not the wire transfer, not the compound, not the fake clinic. The truth was those 6 words, said in a restaurant 4 months before someone poured something into a glass meant for me. Separate her from herself first. Clara took the stand on the 5th day. I had not expected her to. Foster Reed's strategy to that point had been defensive. Challenge the evidence, challenge the witnesses. Avoid putting his client in a position where she could be cross-examined. Putting her on the stand was a risk, and it told me that something in their read of the proceedings had shifted. Either they believed the defensive strategy wasn't working, or they had decided that Clara herself was their best remaining asset, that her composure, her presentation, her ability to perform sincerity under pressure was the only thing left that might move the room. She was, I will say this clearly, impressive on direct examination. She answered Foster Reed's questions in a voice that was measured and slightly sad, the voice of someone wrongly accused who was trying to remain dignified under the weight of it. She described her relationship with me as genuinely affectionate, characterized her interest in my estate as concern rather than calculation, and explained her prior relationship with Morrow as something that had ended years ago and had not been resumed. He contacted me, she said, last year. He said he was in the area and wanted to reconnect. I should have told Daniel. I know that now. I was foolish. But the calls were brief. I thought they were friendly. I had no idea he was involved in any of this. Foster Reed nodded sympathetically. And the folder found in your home? The research notes about Evelyn Hartwell? I'm a planner, she said. I research things. When I started to worry about Evelyn, genuinely worry, because I did genuinely worry, I started keeping notes, things I'd observed, things Daniel mentioned. I know how it looks. But the intent was care, Foster Reed said. Yes, she said. Always. She was good. She was so good that I watched one of the jurors, a middle-aged woman in the 3rd seat who had been leaning forward throughout most of the week, sit back slightly, the way you sit back when something has given you permission to doubt. Then Marcus stood up for cross-examination. He didn't start with the documents. He started with a question I hadn't expected. Mrs. Hartwell, how did you meet your husband? Foster Reed objected. The judge allowed it. Clara answered. A public setting, a professional event, a mutual acquaintance, standard enough. And at that point, Marcus said, you were aware that Daniel Hartwell's mother had founded Hartwell MedTech. I knew he had a family business, yes. A family business his mother had built, that she owned. He paused. Did you look her up? After you met Daniel? A beat. I may have. We have search records, Marcus said, showing that your IP address queried Evelyn Hartwell's name, Hartwell MedTech's valuation, and the Forbes profile of women in medical technology, an article featuring your mother-in-law, within 72 hours of your first documented date with Daniel Hartwell. The middle-aged juror leaned forward again. I was curious, Clara said. That's natural. Of course, Marcus said evenly, and then, without pausing, without letting the room reset. The 47 phone calls to Glenn Morrow. You said they were brief and friendly. The records show 7 of them exceeded 40 minutes in duration. Would you characterize a 40-minute phone call as brief? Some conversations run long. The call on March 14th of this year ran 53 minutes. Do you remember what you discussed? I don't remember specific calls. Mr. Morrow does, Marcus said. He testified that during that call you discussed the specific wording of the Linden Grove assessment and whether it would survive a challenge from an independent physician. He set a document on the edge of the defendant's table. Does that refresh your recollection? Clara looked at the document. She looked at her attorney. She looked at the document again. For the first time since she had taken the stand, the composure showed its seams. I want to be precise, she said carefully. Please, Marcus said. Precision is exactly what this proceeding requires. What followed was 22 minutes of cross-examination that I will not reconstruct in full because it moved the way a well-built argument moves, each question built on the one before it, each answer creating a slightly tighter space than the one before, until the space was too small for any version of the story that didn't include the truth. Marcus did not raise his voice, he did not perform. He simply asked, methodically, about each piece of documented evidence in relation to Clara's account, and watched the gap between the two things widen with each answer. By the end, the composure was gone. Not shattered, Clara was too controlled for that, but hollowed. The warmth that had been in her voice for direct examination had been replaced by something careful and effortful, the visible labor of holding a story together when the facts were pulling it apart at the joints. When Marcus sat down, Foster Reed attempted a brief redirect that managed to do neither significant damage nor significant repair. The judge recessed for the afternoon. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Daniel found me. He looked worse than he had that morning. The testimony had cost him something. I could see it. But there was something else in his face, too. A clarity that hadn't been there a week ago. The painful, unambiguous clarity that comes when the last possible version of a story that you would have preferred turns out not to be the true one. She rehearsed all of that, he said. Not a question. The composure, the way she answered, she rehearsed it. Yes, I said. He looked down the hallway, at nothing in particular. I believed her, he said, for years. Every time she talked about you, about us, about what family should look like, I believed all of it. She was skilled, I said. That's not an excuse. It's not meant to be. I chose my words carefully. You weren't foolish, Daniel. You were trusting. Those aren't the same thing, even when they lead to the same place. He looked at me. You're being kind. I'm being accurate, I said. I'm your mother. I know the difference. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. We stood in that hallway for a moment, the two of us, with everything that had happened between us and around us, and because of us in the last several weeks. And it wasn't comfortable exactly, and it wasn't resolved, and there were still things that needed to be said in rooms that weren't courthouse hallways. But it was real. It was the two of us, present and imperfect, and still, despite everything, on the same side. That was something. The verdict came on the following afternoon. I won't dramatize the moment the foreperson spoke, because the truth is that by the time the words were said, I had known for most of the final day of deliberations that the outcome was going to be what it was. Not because I was certain of justice. I had lived too long and worked too hard in too many rooms to be certain of anything, but because I had watched the case be built piece by piece on a foundation of documented fact, and I had watched Marcus lay each piece with the precision of someone who had spent a career understanding that the truth, properly organized, was usually the most powerful argument in any room. Guilty on the conspiracy count, guilty on the fraud count, guilty on the financial elder abuse count. The poisoning charge, administering a controlled substance without consent, was found guilty as well, with Morrow bearing primary criminal responsibility, but Clara found to have had foreknowledge and to have facilitated. Sentencing would be scheduled separately. I sat still through the reading. My hands were in my lap. Beside me, Marcus exhaled once, quietly. Behind me, Daniel made a sound I couldn't interpret. Not relief, not grief, something that occupied the complicated territory between them. I did not look at Clara. I had looked at her enough. I had spent weeks reading her face, interpreting her expressions, measuring the gap between what her face showed and what her actions documented. I was finished doing that. Whatever was on her face in that moment was hers, and I was done being the audience for it. Instead, I looked at the window on the far side of the room, a high, narrow rectangle of gray autumn sky, and I thought about the word that Patricia Osei had used in Marcus's office. Complainant. Evelyn Marie Hartwell, complainant. The person who had come forward and said, "This happened, here is the evidence, and I will not be silent about it." I had been silent about a great many things in my life. About Gerald's illness when it was still manageable. About my son's distance when it became habitual. About the accumulated loneliness of building something enormous and finding, on the other side of it, that the enormity hadn't filled in the parts it was supposed to fill. I was not silent about this. That felt important. Not triumphant. I want to be clear that what I felt in that room was not triumph. Triumph implies the battle was worth having. This one hadn't been. It had been necessary, and I had won it, and those two things were not the same as good. But I was still here. 72 years old, in a charcoal suit that had been with me through other serious days, and I was still here. And that, for now, was enough. The sentencing happened on a Tuesday in December, 6 weeks after the verdict. I remember the cold that morning, a specific dry cold that came off the pavement in the parking structure and moved through my coat before I had taken 10 steps. I remember the sound of my own heels on the courthouse steps, sharp and even, the way I had trained myself to walk in rooms where people were waiting to measure whether you were afraid. I remember Marcus beside me, half a step back, in the particular way he positioned himself that communicated support without overreach. I remember all of it with a clarity that surprised me, because I had expected by then to feel something like numbness. I had been through 6 weeks of post-verdict legal proceedings, 6 weeks of depositions and motions, and the specific bureaucratic grinding of a criminal case resolving itself into sentences and fines and the administrative language of consequence. I had expected to arrive at sentencing feeling wrung out, depleted. Instead, I felt awake, not triumphant. I had already said what I thought about triumph, and I meant it, but awake in the way you feel after a long illness when the fever finally breaks and the world comes back into focus with an almost uncomfortable sharpness. Clara received 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 18 months if she completed the required programs and maintained compliance. The judge spoke at length before pronouncing the sentence, longer than I had expected, and what she said was precise and unsparing in a way that I had not anticipated from a proceeding I had tried to approach without expectation. She said, "The nature of this conspiracy was particularly harmful not merely because of its financial scope, but because of its method. The defendant deliberately weaponized the legitimate fears that accompany aging, fears about dependency, about diminished capacity, about being a burden, and used those fears as the architecture of a scheme designed to strip a competent adult woman of her legal identity. The court finds this not only criminal, but contemptible. The dignity of older adults before this court and before the law is not negotiable. The dignity of older adults is not negotiable." I sat very still when she said that. I had not cried through any of it, not the trial, not the verdict, not the weeks leading up to this morning, and I did not cry now. But something happened in my chest when those words landed, something that was not relief exactly and not vindication exactly, but which occupied the territory where those two things meet. The place where you understand that the thing you fought for was real, that it mattered, that the fighting of it had mattered. Glenn Morrow received 3 years, reduced from the original exposure in acknowledgement of his cooperation. Raymond Tull had his medical license permanently revoked and received 18 months of supervised release with substantial fines, the court noting that his professional betrayal added a specific dimension of harm to his participation. The two Prescott and Dulaine partners received sentences of 2 and 3 years respectively, and the firm itself was dissolved by order of the court. Viridian Asset Partners had been formally dissolved 3 weeks after the criminal complaint was filed, its accounts frozen and subsequently ordered into a receivership that would eventually return the incorporated capital to sources the court could verify. Claire's attorney made a final statement on her behalf before the sentence was pronounced. It was the statement they always make: acknowledgement of harm, expression of remorse, appeal to mitigating circumstances. And Foster Reed delivered it with professional competence. I listened to it with the detachment of someone who had already processed the thing it was attempting to address. And then it was over. Not everything, not the reverberations. Those would continue for a long time in ways I was only beginning to understand. But the formal part, the documented, procedural, on-the-record part, that was over. We filed out of the courtroom into the corridor, and Marcus shook my hand, a gesture that was unusual enough between us that it said something more than the handshake itself. And Patricia Osei said, "Well done," in the precise, economical way she said everything. And Dara Chin, who had come to the sentencing because she had earned the right to be there, nodded at me from across the corridor with an expression that didn't quite smile but communicated something clear. And then Daniel was beside me. He had been in the courtroom. He had been in the courtroom for the verdict too, and for most of the proceedings. And his presence at all of it was something I had thought about more than I let anyone know. He had not been required to be there. His own attorney had told him it was optional, that his legal position was not improved by attendance. He had come anyway, every time. "It's done," he said. "Yes." He looked at the closed courtroom door for a moment. "She didn't look at me," he said, "the whole time. She never once looked at me." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which was sometimes the right choice. He seemed to understand it as such. "I signed the divorce papers last week," he said. "My attorney filed them Monday." "I know," I said. "He called Marcus to let him know because of the ongoing proceedings." Daniel nodded. He looked tired in a way that wasn't going to be fixed by sleep. The tiredness of a person who has done a significant amount of interior demolition and hasn't yet figured out what to build in the space it left. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel right now," he said. "I don't think you're supposed to feel anything specific," I said. "I think you feel whatever's actually there. What's actually there is a lot of things I don't have names for yet." "That's all right," I said. "You don't need names for them today." He looked at me. "When did you get so—" He stopped. "What?" "Patient," he said. "With me." I thought about that, about the years of distance between us, about the dinners where his phone sat between us, and the calls I had cut short because I was always in the middle of something, and the school plays I had attended late and left early, and the particular look on his face as a teenager when he understood that the company had the kind of claim on me that he didn't know how to compete with, about the accumulated weight of all the moments I had chosen wrong. "I've been practicing," I said. He almost laughed. "Not quite. The day was too heavy for quite, but almost, and almost was enough." "What?" The weeks after sentencing had a quality I had not anticipated. They were slow, not unpleasant, not empty. Just slow, in the way that time moves when the urgent thing has resolved and the thing that replaces it is ordinary living, which doesn't have the same propulsive energy. I woke up in the mornings without the immediate forward lean of a person managing a crisis. I made coffee and sat at my desk and looked out the window at the December light, which was gray and flat and honest, and I thought about what I was going to do next. The Hartwell Foundation was not a sudden idea. It had been forming in the back of my mind for most of the trial, appearing and disappearing, sometimes with the force of something important, and sometimes with the fragility of something I wasn't sure I had the right to claim yet. The company was sold. The crisis was over. The money was mine, protected and confirmed, and sitting in accounts managed by people I trusted. What I did with it from here was the question I had been building toward without knowing I was building toward it. I called Marcus in the second week of December. "I want to set up a foundation," I said. A pause. "What kind?" "Elder justice. Financial protection for older adults who've been targeted the way I was targeted. Legal resources, advocacy, direct support for people who don't have an attorney like you in their contacts." I paused. "It's not an original idea. There are other organizations doing similar work, but there aren't enough of them, and most of them are underfunded, and I have money that needs a purpose. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Are you sure this is what you want? It's not a small undertaking. It's not. You could also simply donate to existing organizations and not take on the operational. Marcus, I said. Yes. I spent 40 years building something operational. I'm not interested in writing checks and stepping back. I paused. I'm interested in building something. Another pause. Longer. All right, he said. Then let's build something. The Hartwell Foundation for Adult Dignity and Financial Protection, which we eventually shortened because the full name was ungainly, to the Hartwell Foundation, was incorporated in January. I spent the early months of that year doing the kind of work I had always done best, identifying the structure, finding the right people, understanding the problem precisely enough to build something that addressed it, rather than something that simply described it. The problem, as I understood it from the inside, was not complicated to state, but was very complicated to solve. Older adults with significant assets were disproportionately targeted by financial exploitation schemes. The schemes took many forms: family members with strategic proximity, professional advisors who manipulated trust, romance scams, unscrupulous legal arrangements. But they shared certain characteristics. They relied on the isolation of the target. They relied on the difficulty older adults often faced in being believed when they reported concerns. They relied on the gap between what the legal system was designed to handle and the specific texture of how these schemes actually operated. Most importantly, they relied on the assumption that the target would not fight back. That age and the weight of the attack and the social complexity of turning on family members or trusted figures would make the calculation simple. Accept the loss, accept the diminishment, accept the verdict that you were finished. That assumption was wrong. I was the evidence that it was wrong, and I intended to fund a great deal more evidence. I hired a director of operations in February. Her name was Josephine Okafor, and she was 38 years old and had spent 12 years working in elder law for a nonprofit that had done good work on a shoestring budget and burned through 3 directors in 4 years from the strain of it. She was not burned out. She had the quality of someone who had found something that mattered and was determined not to be broken by the difficulty of it. But she was ready for something with more capacity. She came to my office for the interview. I had rented a small suite in a building downtown, deliberately not glamorous, because I wanted the foundation to read as functional rather than decorative. And she sat across from me and said, before I had asked her a single question, "I looked you up before I came." "I expected you would," I said. "The trial. What happened?" She looked at me steadily. "I want to know what you understand about what you went through that you didn't understand before it happened. Because that's going to determine what this foundation actually does versus what it says it does." I looked at her for a moment. "What kind of question is that for a job interview?" "The honest kind," she said. I thought about it. I understood before that the schemes existed. I'd read about them. I'd even had a client years ago who went through something similar. I thought I understood it. I paused. What I didn't understand until it happened to me was how much of the scheme's power comes from the inside, from the way it gets you to doubt yourself, to wonder whether the people around you are actually right, whether you are, in fact, tired or confused or managing too much for someone your age. The most dangerous part of what Clara did wasn't the drug or the fake document. It was the months of quiet narrative building. The drip, drip, drip of "you should rest, you deserve rest, let us help," that was designed to soften my own certainty about myself. That's the part people don't understand from the outside. That's the part that needs addressing. Josephine Okafor was quiet for a moment. "When can you start?" I asked. "Monday," she said. Good. She was the right person. That became apparent within a week, and then within a month became completely undeniable. She had the specific quality that the work required. She could hold the operational and the human simultaneously without letting either one collapse the other. She knew how to build systems without losing sight of the people the systems were supposed to serve. She disagreed with me openly when she thought I was wrong, which was frequent enough to be useful and not so frequent as to be exhausting. We argued in the third month about the scope of the initial program. I wanted to move quickly, to have the first set of funded legal partnerships operational within 6 months. She thought 12 months was the more responsible timeline, that moving too fast would produce visible failures that would undermine the foundation's credibility before it had established itself. I thought she was being cautious to the point of inaction. She thought I was confusing speed with effectiveness. We were both partially right, which is how most productive arguments end. We landed on 9 months. Noah Bennett was not someone I had planned to see again. He had given a brief statement to the investigators early in the process, confirming what he had witnessed at the restaurant, confirming that he had warned me. And that statement had been part of the evidentiary record, though it had not been needed in court because the physical and documentary evidence was sufficient without it. I had his contact information through Marcus, but I had not reached out, partly because the proceedings had been all-consuming, and partly because I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. He reached out to me in March. He sent a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, which startled me by its formality and moved me by its sincerity. He said he had followed the case in the news and was glad of the outcome. He said he had thought about that evening many times, wondering whether he had done the right thing in saying something, whether he had overstepped. He said he had told his mother about it, and his mother had said of course he'd done the right thing, but that hadn't entirely settled it for him. He said he hoped I was well. He was 25 years old and he had made a decision in a restaurant, a decision that cost him nothing, perhaps, in the immediate moment, but that required a particular kind of moral clarity that a lot of people didn't have at 25 or at any age. The decision to say something when you see something. The decision to not let the calculation of social risk override the simpler calculation of what was right. I wrote back. I told him that he had done exactly the right thing and that his intervention had given me the seconds I needed to act, and that without those seconds, the evening, and everything that followed, might have looked very different. I told him that his instinct to speak had mattered enormously to a woman he didn't know and had no obligation to help. I also told him that the Hartwell Foundation was hiring, that we were looking for people who understood what it meant to notice things and act on what they noticed, and that if he was ever interested in work that was more interesting than restaurant service, he should call Josephine Okafor's number, which I included at the bottom of the letter. He called the following Tuesday. He was hired as a community outreach coordinator in April. He was, as it turned out, better at the work than almost anyone would have predicted from the outside, because he had the quality that the work required more than any other. He paid attention, not just to the obvious things, but to the edges, the slight thing that didn't fit, the moment that passed too quickly, the person in the room who needed something but hadn't found the words for it yet. I watched him in a community meeting in his 3rd month, talking with a group of older adults about the Foundation's resources, and I thought, he would have been exactly like this that night at the restaurant too, not performing attention, just actually paying it. Clara's parole hearing was in the fall, 18 months after sentencing. I was notified as the complainant of record and given the option to submit a statement. I spent a week thinking about whether to submit one and what it should say. What I eventually wrote was not what I had expected to write. I had thought I would be clinical, a statement of facts, a clear account of impact, a position on the parole question based on the evidence of whether rehabilitation had genuinely occurred. That was the appropriate form, and I understood the appropriate form. But when I sat down to write it, what came out was something else, something more personal. I wrote about what it means to be 72 years old and to have someone look at everything you've built and decide that the only reason it still belongs to you is that you haven't been adequately managed yet. I wrote about the specific harm of treating an older person's identity as an obstacle to be navigated rather than a life to be respected. I wrote about the difference between a mistake and a scheme, between a lapse of judgment and 14 months of coordinated action designed to strip a person of their legal self. And then I wrote something that surprised me as I wrote it. I wrote that I did not believe incarceration was the only form of accountability that mattered, that I was more interested in whether Clara Whitmore understood what she had done, Not as a legal matter, not as an abstract ethical failure, but as a human one, than I was in the precise length of her sentence. That understanding of that kind, if it was real, was more useful to the world than its absence. I said I did not oppose parole, with the condition that she complete the financial ethics and rehabilitation programming she had been assigned, and that she have no contact with me, my son, or anyone connected to my estate or the foundation. The parole board granted the hearing. Clara was released in October. I did not feel triumph when I heard. I did not feel the specific satisfaction that popular imagination assigns to this kind of moment, the vindicated party watching the adversary face reduced circumstances. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated. The awareness that the chapter had closed and the book continued, that the story did not end with her release any more than it had ended with the verdict. Because stories don't actually end, they just become something you carry differently. Daniel told me in a brief phone call that week that Clara had reached out to him through her attorney, requesting a conversation. He said he had declined. "I don't need to hear whatever she has to say," he said. "Not right now, maybe not ever. I haven't decided." "That's yours to decide," I said. "Yeah." A pause. "How are you doing with it? Her being out?" I thought about that honestly before I answered. "I'm all right," I said. "She's not the center of my attention anymore. That's the difference." Did that happen gradually, or did you just decide?" "Both," I said. "The deciding came first, the gradual came after." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on that," he said. "I know," I said. "You're doing better than you think." The first full year of the Hartwell Foundation, in numbers, 34 legal partnerships across 11 states, providing pro bono representation to older adults facing financial exploitation. 417 cases opened, 62 successfully resolved in favor of the complainant, with asset recovery totaling just over $3 million returned to people who had been targeted. A public education campaign that reached, by the end of the year, an audience Josephine measured in the hundreds of thousands. The number I thought about most was not any of those. It was 14. The number of people who had called our intake line in the first year and said some version of the same thing. I didn't think anyone would believe me, not because they had been told they weren't believable, because they had absorbed, from somewhere in the culture around them, the idea that their age made their account suspect, that being old meant being confused, that being confused meant being wrong, that being wrong meant being manageable. 14 people who had needed someone to say, "We believe you, your experience is real, and you have the right to fight for what's yours." That number was small. I knew it was small relative to the scope of the problem, relative to the scale of what Josephine had mapped in the research we'd commissioned, relative to what I understood the foundation would need to become over the next decade to make any real dent in something this large. But 14 was also 14. 14 real people with real assets and real identities that they had not surrendered. 14 who had not become what someone else had decided they should be. I thought about that number on the evening of the Foundation's first-year anniversary. When Josephine and I sat in the small conference room of our slightly larger office, we had moved in August when we needed more space, with cups of coffee and the year-end report spread between us. Outside, the city was doing its early winter thing, dark before 5, the particular quality of cold that made the lit windows of buildings across the street look like something deliberate. "We need to talk about year 2, Josephine said. "I know. The caseload exceeded capacity in the third quarter. We have a wait list that I'm uncomfortable with. We expand the legal partnerships. That requires more funding." "I'll fund it," I said. She looked at me steadily. "Evelyn, at some point we need other donors. You can't be the sole source indefinitely. It creates a dependency that's not structurally sound." "I know that," I said. "I have a list of potential major donors I've been cultivating since September. I'm having lunch with the first one next week." She blinked, slightly, a rare expression of surprise. "You've been working on donor development this whole time and you didn't tell me?" "I didn't want you to tell me I was doing it too fast." A pause. "Were you?" "Probably," I said. "But the lunch is next week anyway." She shook her head once, in the way she shook her head when she disagreed with my methods, but couldn't argue with my results. It was one of my favorite expressions she made. Daniel came for dinner in November. Not a restaurant. My house. I cooked. imperfectly, which I had never been a particularly skilled cook and had not become one in my 70s, but I made the things I could make reliably, and I set the table properly, and I lit the candles because that was the kind of detail that had always mattered to me, even when other people found it unnecessary. He arrived on time, which was itself something. He used to be habitually late, the working late orbit of a person whose schedule was always slightly beyond his control. And on time was a small thing that said a larger one. We sat down. We ate. We talked the way we had been slowly learning over the past year to talk, imperfectly, sometimes circling things before landing on them, occasionally going quiet in ways that were no longer the hostile quiet of distance, but something softer. We were not there yet. Wherever there was, whatever the version of a relationship between a mother and a son looked like after the particular year we had had. But we were moving toward it, which was more than I had believed was possible, on certain nights in certain courtrooms, and that movement was itself a form of something I valued. He told me he had started seeing a therapist. He said it the way men of his generation often said things like that, slightly sideways, like he was acknowledging it rather than offering it. Good, I said. Not elaborating, just good. She asked me about you, he said. About us. About why we were distant, she called it, for so long. What did you say? He looked at his plate for a moment. I said I think we both decided work was safer, that we could be proud of each other at a distance more easily than we could know each other up close. He paused. She asked who decided that first. I said I didn't know. She said it doesn't matter who decided it first. She said what matters is who decides to stop. I was quiet for a moment. She sounds smart, I said. She charges accordingly. I laughed. It surprised me. The laugh and its ease, and the way it sat between us without awkwardness. He smiled at it, and the smile reached his eyes, and that was the moment I allowed myself to think. We are going to be all right. Not perfect, not fully repaired, not without the weight of everything that had been lost or damaged or built poorly in the years we had not known how to be in each other's lives. But all right. Actually, all right. That was not a small thing. I want you to understand that. Because I have been telling you a story about betrayal and legal proceedings and financial schemes and verdicts, and all of that is true, and all of it mattered. But the thing that mattered most, the thing I would not trade the year for, terrible as the year had been, was sitting across from my son at a properly set table with candles, and imperfectly cooked food, and laughing at something, and seeing him smile back. That was what they had almost taken from me, not the money. The money was significant, and I do not pretend otherwise, but money is replaceable in ways that other things are not. What they had almost taken, what the scheme at its center was designed to do, was take me out of my own life, remove me as an agent, convert me from a person who acted and decided and built into a person who was acted upon, who was managed, who was filed in a facility somewhere and visited on appropriate occasions and otherwise administered like a situation that had been resolved. They had almost taken my right to be present in my own story. I kept it. And in keeping it, I kept the table and the candles and the laugh and the smile and the foundation with its 14 people in the first year and its expanding partnerships and Josephine's practical disagreements and Noah's quality of attention and the early mornings at the scarred desk and the evening light going amber and gray and all of the ordinary living that is what a life is actually made of, underneath the years and the achievements and the things that end up in legal documents. I kept all of it. I want to speak to you directly now. If you have stayed with me this far, through all of it, the restaurant and the hospital corridor and the courtroom and the long, slow work of the aftermath, then I think you deserve that directness. I am not telling you this story because it is dramatic, though it is dramatic. I am not telling you because I want you to admire me, though I confess that I am human enough to have wanted that at certain moments. I am telling you this story because I believe it contains something real about the way the world works. And I think the real thing is worth saying clearly. Here it is. Age is not an apology. Not for what you've built, not for the space you take up, not for the certainty you've earned by surviving long enough to accumulate it. I am 72 years old. I built a company. I sold it. I was targeted for the specific crime of having succeeded. And the targeting relied on the assumption that my age made me soft enough to take, quiet enough to manage, and invisible enough that no one would look too closely at what was being done to me. That assumption was wrong, but the reason it was wrong was not because I am exceptional. The reason it was wrong is that I refused to accept the premise. And that refusal, that is something any person can choose, regardless of age, regardless of what they've built, regardless of whether they have a Marcus Vail in their contacts or a Dara Chin on speed dial. The refusal is a choice. The decision to remain present in your own life, to insist on the validity of what you know and what you've built and what you are owed as a person who has simply lived, that is not a privilege. That is a right. Let me say the other thing too. The thing I sat with at my desk at 5 in the morning, alone, when no one was asking me to perform or strategize or decide. Love that comes with conditions attached to your assets is not love. It is negotiation dressed in family language. And I understand how hard it is to see that, because the people who do this are often people you have brought close to you, people you have trusted with your key and your dinner table and your son's name. They know what warmth looks like because they've studied it. They know what care sounds like because they've spent time learning the right words. But love does not research your financial accounts within 72 hours of meeting your partner. Love does not keep a file of your observed cognitive lapses. Love does not make 47 phone calls to a co-conspirator while holding your hand across a restaurant table and saying, "We just want what's best." Love shows up. Love stays when there is nothing to gain. Love does not require a guardianship petition to justify itself. If someone in your life is showing you warmth that always seems to intensify when your finances are on the table, pay attention to that. If someone is gently, persistently building a narrative that you are tired, confused, less capable than you were, ask yourself who benefits from that narrative. If you have built something with your life and you are being encouraged to relax your grip on it by people who stand to benefit from your relaxed grip, that is information. Take it seriously. You deserve to be known, not managed. You deserve to be believed. You deserve to have the things you built belong to you for exactly as long as you choose to hold them. And if someone tries to take them by trying to take you first, fight back. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of the clear and simple understanding that your dignity is not a negotiating position. It is not a symptom of stubbornness. It is not an obstacle to be routed around by people with 14 months of planning and a private lab contact. It is yours. It was always yours. I thought about Gerald, that November evening after Daniel left, washing the dishes in my quiet kitchen. Gerald, who had loved me imperfectly and completely, who had never once looked at what I built and calculated what he could extract from it, who had sometimes been frustrated by my hours and my focus and the particular gravitational pull of the company on every room we were in together, but who had never, in 31 years of marriage, made me feel that his love had a condition attached to my continued usefulness. I thought about what he would have said if he had been there for the year I had just been through. I think he would have said something impractical, something that didn't solve the legal problem but addressed the human one. He was always better at the human one than I was. He would have put his hand on my arm and said something like, "You're still you, Evie. The rest is just paperwork." I missed him, in that kitchen, in a way that was clean and old and not desperate. The way you miss someone who is genuinely gone, not with grasping but with a kind of sorrow that has found its shape. I dried my hands. I turned off the light. I walked through my house, the house that was mine, the house that no one was going to sign me out of, the house where I had sat at a scarred desk at 5 in the morning and built the beginning of the answer to the worst year of my life. And I felt the particular weight of it, which was not heavy in the way that burdens are heavy, but full in the way that living is full when you have not been separated from yourself. I was still here. I was still entirely, completely, unmanageably here. And whatever came next, whatever the foundation became, whatever Daniel and I built in the remaining years of the relationship, we were slowly and imperfectly reconstructing. Whatever the ordinary mornings and the difficult ones and the ones that surprised me with their unexpected grace, I was going to meet it as the person I had always been, not the person someone else had decided I should be, not the woman in the facility, not the name on a guardianship petition, not the subject of a fabricated assessment in a filing cabinet in my own house. Evelyn Marie Hartwell, 72 years old, founder, survivor, complainant, and still, despite all of it, against all of their arithmetic, standing. The woman they thought was finished had not yet begun.